Start this afternoon's seminar. Welcome. Thank you all for coming. This is one of the regular but irregular Washington History seminars, since we normally meet on Mondays, but we had this special opportunity to have John and Julia speak to us today, and we grabbed it. So this is a special seminar in history, historians in the Anthropocene. As many of you know, but some of you probably don't, the Washington History Seminar is a joint venture of the National History Center, of which I am the director. My name is Dane Kennedy, and the Wilson Center for History and Public Policy. And we are supported, very marginally, but are supported by the Society for Historians of American Foreign Relations, and are always very grateful to them for their support, and also by George Washington University. And if any of you have any interest in providing support yourself, speak to me, and we can make arrangements. I want to also mention that this particular event is being co-sponsored by the Wilson Center's Environmental Change and Security Program, and I want to thank them for their co-sponsorship. So let me introduce our two speakers. I'll start with John, because he's going to speak first. John McNeill is a historian at Georgetown University, and a member of the Anthropocene Working Group of the International Union of the Geological Sciences. His most recent book is The Great Acceleration, an Environmental History of the Anthropocene since 1945, with Peter Engelke.
That's an authentic pronunciation. He pronounces it Engelke.
Okay. And Mosquito Empire, Ecology and War in the Greater Caribbean, which is a fabulous book, plus plenty of others. He also happens to be the president-elect of the American Historical Association. And Julia Adeney Thomas teaches history at the University of Notre Dame. She is a Japanese historian, but also obviously an environmental historian. Her publications include Reconfiguring Modernity, Concepts of Nature in Japanese Political Ideology, Japan at Nature's Edge, The Environmental Context of a Global Power, and more than 40 articles in journals like Environmental History. So before we start, let me remind you, if you have a cell phone, please put it on mute or turn it off so you don't get an inopportune phone call in the middle of one of our speakers' presentations. And I'll turn it over to John.
Great. Thank you very much, Dane. It is a pleasure to be at the Wilson Center and speaking at a National History Center event. Julia and I are part of a small, very small tribe of historians concerned with the debates and concept of the Anthropocene. Our approaches, I would say, are complementary in that Julia is a deep thinker, and I will offer a much more pedestrian approach to the Anthropocene. So I'll go first, and then it will just get deeper and deeper as we go along. So here's what I expect to try to do in the next 20 minutes. I may have to speak fast in order to do it. I'll first explain some of the rival concepts of the Anthropocene and tip my own hand by saying what I think it should mean. I'll say a little bit about the Anthropocene Working Group and what a historian is doing in a body of geologists. I'll say a little bit about some of the strange features of the Anthropocene Working Group from a historian's perspective, and then conclude with a little rumination on what this all might mean, if anything, for historians. And that ideally will segue into Julia's presentation, which will be a lot of, well, the sort of thing that a self-described theory head might do. So, you have seen representations of Earth history that approximate this. We are, according to the geologists in this little slice here, called the Holocene. It's 11,700 years old. But, as most of you are aware, in the last 15 or so years, a growing contingent of natural scientists and other scholars have been maintaining that the Holocene is over and something new has begun, and that something should be called, at least some of them think so, the Anthropocene or Anthropocene. The disagreements extend even to the pronunciation of the term. There are many, many, many versions of this, and I'll mention just a very few of them. The first distinction to draw is between old and new Anthropocene. So some scholars maintain that if we are to recognize a new interval of time in Earth history as the Anthropocene, we have to recognize that it's actually not new, it's really old. Humans have been affecting the Earth in fundamental ways, either for hundreds of years or thousands of years, depending on whom you ask. The classic formulation of this by an atmospheric chemist called Paul Crutzen, Nobel Prize winner, is that it's the advent of intensive fossil fuel use and the Industrial Revolution that really marks the beginning of the Anthropocene. However, and I used to make that same argument. However, the majority of opinion within the Anthropocene Working Group, an opinion to which I assent, is that a better birthday for the Anthropocene would be the middle of the 20th century. And I'll explain in a bit why I think that is true, but first apologize for having changed my mind over the last 15 years, reminding you of this very handy quotation attributed to Emerson. Whenever I contradict myself, I have recourse to this. Within many intellectual traditions, it's possible to compromise on the kinds of things that Anthropocene debates emphasize, such as when the Anthropocene began, and historians would find this plausible enough to speak about a gradual development of something, the slow onset of the Anthropocene. But within the tribe of geologists known as stratigraphers, that's really hard to do. Stratigraphers are the ones who pay attention to the strata in the rock, and for them, boundaries are ideally precise and not gradations. So that makes the arguments about the chronology of the Anthropocene a bit harder or less susceptible to compromise. A second distinction, other than old and new Anthropocenes, is good and bad Anthropocenes. So there is a set of people interested in the Anthropocene who embrace the notion that humankind plays a powerful shaping role on the Earth, in the biosphere, and over various Earth systems and biogeochemical cycles. Here's a parenthesis for those of you who have forgotten your Earth science from your school days. Biogeochemical cycles just means the movement of things such as carbon, water, nitrogen, sulfur among the oceans, the atmosphere, living things, the Earth itself. There are several important biogeochemical cycles, but I mentioned the four most important ones. At any rate, the people who believe in a good Anthropocene, sometimes they're called eco-modernists. Here's a good example of them. You may remember Stuart Brand is the publisher of the Whole Earth Catalog 45 years ago or so. And in that, he had this interesting quotation: "We are as gods and might as well get good at it." That is more or less the motto of eco-modernists and those who embrace the notion of a good Anthropocene. That is, we're already managing in a scattershot way the Earth and its systems. We might as well do it in a systematic, rational, and planned way. And that view obviously includes confidence in our capacity to do so without mucking things up drastically. Those who take a different point of view, sort of the bad Anthropocene, argue that it is either highly likely or close to inevitable that the impact of humans on all these systems is going to be disruptive and will make the Earth more unruly, and we cannot actually expect to manage it rationally and so as to ensure an efficient and enduring and agreeable outcome. These debates are a little bit reminiscent of ones from a generation and a half ago in the 1960s and 70s among those who argued that the Earth is running out of important resources, and on the other side, those who argued that not to worry, technology will come to the rescue and there will always be substitutes. And so scarcity is not a limiting factor. Techno-optimists, as they were sometimes called. So, oh dear. There is you see how it's always impossible to manage things perfectly, rationally, just as they should be. Sometimes an extra A just sneaks in to the first word of one slide. So, my view is that the techno-optimists are a bit too optimistic, and that managing things with the complexity of Earth systems is actually beyond the reliable capacity of the human species as we know it. So I imagine that the Anthropocene will continue to be on the unruly side, and if anything is likely to become more unruly. I also adopt the view that the mid-20th century is the best way to understand the onset of the Anthropocene, and my reasons for that is encapsulated in these various curves. You can't see what they represent, but I'll give you a quick rundown of a few of them. The point of it is that, and this date here is 1950, you can't see that either, that they all begin a sharp acceleration in the middle of the 20th century. And they represent temperature, populations, carbon dioxide concentration, tropical forest and woodland loss, and a whole lot of other things, fisheries. The same data broken out here, the socioeconomic part of the equation, Earth system part of the equation, but the story is approximately the same in every one of these variables. Now, that is not entirely accidental because the people who put this together, I happen to know, cherry-picked these variables in order to show precisely this. But they were not being wildly dishonest intellectually in doing so. You would have to be wildly intellectually dishonest to find 20 variables connected to Earth systems that do not show a screeching acceleration in the middle of the 20th century. Here's another representation of a fragment of this concept. This is the carbon cycle from 1850 to 2008. Here, this is the expansion of carbon emissions, fossil fuel, and from burning vegetation. And here's where it all goes, into the ocean, into soils, and into the atmosphere. And the point here is this, again, middle of the 20th century is a point of inflection in the history of the carbon cycle. A very dramatic one, in fact, probably more dramatic than any other in millions, billions of years. So, that's my version of the Anthropocene, 1945 or 1950 to the present, and unfortunately unruly and not easily susceptible to management. So for the last very few years, I have been a member of this group, the Anthropocene Working Group, which is charged with the responsibility of deciding whether or not there is an Anthropocene. The geologists, as I'll explain in a moment, do things differently from historians, and that is what the Anthropocene is all about. Most of its membership is British, most of them are stratigraphers, a higher proportion are geologists, but curiously enough, there are some interlopers such as myself. And mostly it works over email and debates various points, occasionally publishes some papers, and now is doing some hardcore stratigraphy, which I'm not really involved in. The search for the perfect, to use the colloquial term first, golden spike, or global stratigraphic section and point, which is what they call something you can point to in the rock or ice that delineates the difference between one interval of geological time and its predecessor. I have never met most of these people. They hold their meetings in Europe during the school year. I can't go, but I still try to play a role. Now, this is a really weird experience for me and a really weird enterprise by any standards. From the viewpoint of stratigraphers, it's weird because it has people like me involved. There have been several working groups trying to work out the fine points of how to slice Earth history into intervals of time, but up to this point, they have not had non-geologists on them. This one has a lawyer, it has an ecologist, an oceanographer, a soil scientist, an archaeologist, 2 historians, the other one being Naomi Oreskes, a historian of science. So that's unprecedented, and a lot of stratigraphers regard this as unjustified. Not the ones who are on the group, but others who are not. Maybe because if there's a historian on the group, that means there's one fewer stratigrapher who gets to be on the group. But it actually is no privilege to be on the group. You don't get paid. You just do work for free. The second really peculiar thing from the point of view of the geology profession is that the work of the Anthropocene Working Group is essentially backwards in terms of process. Normally, people study the rocks and fossils and the ice for years, and then they come up with a suggestion for a revision to the geological timescale. In this case, it's exactly the reverse. Somebody came up with an idea for a revision to the geological timescale who wasn't even a geologist or a stratigrapher. People who did it were Crutzen, the atmospheric chemist, and also Eugene Sturmer, an aquatic biologist. And then after that, and only after that, people start poking around in the rock and the ice trying to find the evidence for the existence of the Anthropocene. So intellectually and in terms of process, it seems to a lot of geologists exactly backwards. From my point of view, it's also weird. First of all, because it exists. As a historian, I have never ever encountered a working group that convened to try to decide whether or not there was an antebellum period or a Meiji period. All right, we don't operate that way. We are entirely anarchic when it comes to periodization. So if, for example, I wanted to argue that there was a Dane Kennedy period in the history of Washington, D.C., nobody would stop me. Nobody would necessarily listen to me, but I might be persuasive enough that forever after, historians would refer to the Dane Kennedy era in the history of Washington. That's okay as far as historians are concerned. It's certainly not okay as far as stratigraphers and geologists are concerned. They have to have a bureaucratic, authenticating process. So that is weird by my standards. The second thing that's really weird by my standards is the fetishistic quality of the golden spike for stratigraphers. And I say this affectionately because I like a lot of these people. I like all these people that I'm working with. But they are weird. And they would describe me in candid moments as weird. And they would be correct about that. So one of the strangest things about them is that if the Anthropocene is to exist, it has to have a golden spike, and that golden spike has to be durable by geological standards. And that doesn't mean dozens of years or hundreds of years or even thousands of years. It means millions of years. And if I say to them, there won't be geologists in millions of years, and even if there were, they would not think the way that you think, they would agree, but they say that doesn't matter. You still need a golden spike that's going to be there in millions of years, or else you cannot have an Anthropocene. So right now, these hardworking stratigraphers are scouring the world looking for things that are going to be there in millions of years, have what they call preservation potential. Further eccentricities. You might think that for geology this was a big deal, whether they're going to have a significant revision in the geological time scale. I think it's a big deal. But it's being done by people in their spare time. They have no funding. I guess I should say we have no funding. And nobody can dedicate any time to it except what they steal from the rest of their lives. And the way that people get onto the Anthropocene group, or got on, it seems like nobody else is being recruited, is very informal. In my own case, this is the only one I know about, the chair of the group just asked me if I wanted to do it. He assured me there would be no work. I believed him, and that's how it happened. That strikes me as also peculiar, at least eccentric. And lastly, they seem to be in absolutely no hurry. The last major revision to the geographical timescale was proposed in 1885 and formally ratified in 2007. That is, it took 122 years to gather the evidence and make the case and vote on it, because they vote on these things. So don't hold your breath for the formalization of the Anthropocene. If my arithmetic is correct, if they go at the same leisurely pace as with the Holocene, it'll be in 2138 before a decision is made. I actually think it'll be a little sooner than that. This is an instance of a golden spike. So I'm coming a little closer to the end now. What can historians make of all this? We're trying to make something of it, at least a handful of us. So is everybody else, it seems. Literature scholars, philosophers, journalists. It seems from my perspective, and I could be unduly blinkered in my outlook on this, but it seems to me that the Anthropocene concept is colonizing a lot of disciplines very fast in the last few years, although it means different things to different disciplines and different things to different individuals. And I wonder if there's any concept that has been so successful in its colonization of a variety of disciplines since Darwin. What I think it helps us do as historians is recognize the anomalous quality of the last 70 years or so, which I've tried to indicate with a few graphs. It helps us, I think, grapple with longer time spans as well and try to link up human history and Earth history and contemplate some of the immensities of time that normally historians try to put out of mind. And it might, I'm not sure that Julia agrees with me on this, help us think more about how our work as historians may have some utility for the future, which I maintain is something that most historians do not normally think about. One interesting further graph. This is the number of articles with the word Anthropocene in them, shooting up after about 2005, 2006. What can historians add to the concept and these debates? So far, I would say most of what we have added is fuzziness and further confusion about the meaning of the term and concept. But I think there's potential for some other contributions. One is rigorous attention to notions of causation, which is an obsession of ours as historians, but it's something that normally the stratigraphers don't bother with. It's not really all that interesting to them. But in this case, the Anthropocene, I think, should be different, must be different, and historians can contribute to the understanding of why there is such a thing, if you believe in it, as the Anthropocene. And secondly, the geologists and stratigraphers, their long suit is not recognizing the heterogeneity of human society. And anthropologists are particularly militant about this point, but historians, I think, can also serve as a ground-truthing squad, emphasizing that, yes, if there is an Anthropocene, it may be, from the geological point of view, uniform, but from the human point of view, it's anything but. in the way that it is experienced, interpreted around the world. This pair of wonderful quotations by, a novelist and a historian who had radically different notions of causation. This is merely to emphasize the centrality of debate about causation within the historical profession. I'm a little more with Tolstoy than I am with A.J.P. Taylor on this. And I think this is the end. What problems does the Anthropocene pose for historians? Well, some historians, including myself, have long maintained that history is actually useful. Thucydides gave us a few choice phrases for this, which I have quoted here. But if we recognize the Anthropocene concept, if we accept the notion that Earth history and human history are in a brand new moment, then have we not devalued the past and made it less useful in the sense that Thucydides claimed that it was useful? I hope that's not true, but maybe it is true. Do we need a different kind of history for the Anthropocene? I argue all too often yes. Texts are not enough. We need to incorporate all sorts of data from all sorts of sciences in order to have a proper history for the Anthropocene. A lot of historians disagree with me vehemently about that. It's really difficult to do. Maybe disciplines as a whole are Holocene thinking. We can blame them on Aristotle. We can blame them on 19th century German universities. But maybe they are outmoded and blind us to some urgent realities. I don't go quite that far. I still think disciplines have their utility. So here is the summary of my views, and then I will pipe down. I take the view that at the mid-20th century birth date is best, that the Anthropocene is unruly and not easily managed. Point 3 is just that this is by no means over. The geologists have not made up their mind. Historians are just getting into the game, and what contributions we can really make remain to be seen, I think. Unfortunately, we will debate the matter endlessly because we are so anarchic in our traditions, and it'll take us a long time to make a coherent contribution. Yeah, let's end it there. Julia, take it away.
John, first we're giving you a hand.
You want this?
Sure, just stand up.
If you're going to stand up, you need it.
All right, that's a very hard act to follow. I'm going to begin, though, with a question, which is to ask you all how many of you had worked with the concept of the Anthropocene or knew what it meant before you heard this lucid explanation. So most everybody has. This is one of the things I'm trying to map. I'm very interested in how far this concept has spread, how many people are discussing it, because last year at about this time I was in South Korea and they asked me to speak to the diplomats in training. And South Korean diplomats are extremely well trained. They are the creme de la creme. Needless to say, South Korea needs all the kind of diplomatic help it can just now to keep things balanced in East Asia. And I asked this group, interestingly more than 50% women, whether they had heard of the concept of the Anthropocene, and they hadn't. So we have a problem here with a concept which is unevenly understood. And that's partly why John and I today wanted, thanks to Dane, to put together this workshop, perhaps needlessly, because you all are obviously au courant. So what I want to do is first say how much John and I agree. You know, listen to the man. That's basically what I'm saying here. And he's promised that I will be deep. This is, of course, unnerving. I won't be deep. But I did want to say that I think we are in agreement first and foremost on the importance of getting the science right. We're finding now that as this concept travels outside of the Anthropocene Working Group, we're beginning to find people sort of making it up as they go along, and all sorts of strange ideas are emerging. And this makes me very nervous. And I think our grounds have to be understanding the geostratigrapher's idea of a GSSP, or however they decide to measure this, and really try to get this science right. I think we can move out from that a little bit by looking at some of the Earth system science that is interested in planetary boundaries. And I think that that is important because that helps people to understand that the Anthropocene is not the same as climate change, but involves questions of biodiversity and the overshoot of phosphorus and nitrogen that we're already experiencing, and many other facets of planetary change. So it's not just climate change. It's not that, quote, simple. So I think that there are ways in which this particular geostratigraphic definition of the Anthropocene is our sort of baseline, but we can move out beyond that to planetary boundaries and also to the great acceleration about which John has written so eloquently. And I say this in part, again, following John. We did compare slides this morning. I didn't realize we were both going to show Charles Darwin. But I say this in part because when I was working on Meiji Japan and Meiji Japanese politics, what was so alarming is that the West's greatest intellectual contribution to East Asia was not the guy on your left, but the guy on your right, whose name is Herbert Spencer. And so we had this translation of Darwin's notions of evolution into politics, into international politics, into the understanding of all sorts of fields through Herbert Spencer, and so much of this had the bad results we know about, things like eugenics and the suggestion, in fact, by Herbert Spencer when confronted with the first constitution ever written by a non-Western nation, by Japan. They went off and they asked him what he thought of the constitution they were writing, and he said, basically, you little yellow people, it'll take 8 generations before you can have a constitution. So I want us to think about getting the science right because we know what happens when we get the science wrong. What I'm interested in also is how many people are angry at the concept of the Anthropocene. Really angry, kind of in times vitriolic. And that interests me because I think it suggests how truly challenging it is to many disciplines, including my own and John's, the discipline of history. Because I think this challenges not only our understanding of the sciences, but of course our understanding of what it means to be human in this world. If we are suggesting that in the absence of the human species, the planet would not be undergoing this radical change, then we are truly talking about a moment of rupture. And that is, I think, extremely alarming to a lot of people. And so you get a great deal of pushback, and some of it's not entirely pleasant, when you introduce this term. So what are these challenges to history? I think that there are 3 of them. And again, I'm following John's reasoning in many ways. First of all, the Anthropocene suggests that we have entered an unprecedented era, epoch, but even more than that. In fact, we are putting out more carbon now than has been put out in 66 million years. So it's not just unprecedented in the last few centuries, or even in the time span in which Homo sapiens have been on this planet, but 66 million years. That's a lot of carbon. So what's happening now is something we've had no experience of. And if history is to mean something, there's got to be some connection, some continuity between the past and the present, but this is unprecedented. It's also irreversible. If it is true, and it seems very likely to be true, that we're entering the 6th great extinction, we're not going to be able to recreate these animals. I know they're trying to get those aurochs, am I pronouncing this correctly, generate extinct species from old, you obviously know about this, from old genes. Yeah, and you know, we could maybe do that here and there, but we're not getting back whole ecosystems. We can't do that. And the other thing is that it is so unpredictable. One of the things about history, in order for history to be useful, is the suggestion that there is a kind of continuity between the past, the present, and the future. That even if there are revolutions, even if there are the transformations in the climate and the natural disasters of the Holocene, we have never had the kinds of radical tipping points and completely unprecedented events that some of the scientists are now beginning to forecast. So we're facing a situation where our Earth system is entering a condition which is unprecedented, irreversible, and unpredictable. And the question is, what good is history? Why bother with history? What can history possibly do in relationship to the science? And of course, it is in the interests of John and myself and of a number of you in the room to immediately say, of course, we're absolutely vital to this. We do have something to do, we do have something to contribute, and everyone must wear a bow tie, because we know this is the classic uniform. Well, I would answer this question in part by saying it depends on what you mean by history. And I think this is where the theory head business comes in. I'm a little reluctant to embrace that term, but okay. So one way to think about history is to use it in the sense of just the past. History is the past. Obviously, earth scientists are also looking at the past, and therefore our disciplines can perhaps meld, that we can get a science that talks about the Big Bang, the development of Earth, life on Earth, dinosaurs wiped out, all these different periods, Homo sapiens, megafauna extinction, the last major ice age. But instead, as you know, historians have usually just done this last little bit. But many of our colleagues are beginning to think, okay, maybe we don't have to restrict ourselves to written sources, to cities, to post-development of agriculture. Maybe history can look way, way back. Maybe history can expand. Well, yes, maybe it can do this. And we've had a number of tries of doing this, really interesting work that does expand our minds and make us think differently. The man pictured here is David Christian, who some of you may know. He is the big history guy. Bill Gates is very interested in this notion that you can begin history at the Big Bang and end up with big bangs. That this is actually one story, one narrative from, 14 billion years ago to today, roughly. And this is a really interesting idea, one I'm going to voice discontent with in a moment, but there's a kind of fascination with that. History and the history of the universe are essentially the same. There have been other attempts of historians to think about human history in relationship to various sciences. I've put some of them up here. Climate history is interested in contributing to the discussion of climate scientists by showing evidence out of texts that corroborate evidence in Earth ice cores or that kind of work, pollen samples. Deep history, and it looks at the development of the human brain. Dan Smale at Harvard is the one who spearheaded this idea. So you began about 70 or 80,000 years ago with history when our brains began to resemble the kinds of brains we have today. At least that's the theory. Or neurohistory is the idea of Ed Russell, again, a combination of the sciences and the history. And the idea here is that there's true consilience between these fields. History studies the past, sciences can study the past. We are essentially doing the same thing. So I think there's some interesting work that emerges out of this. But when I think of how can history be useful, I don't think that the answer lies in following in the footsteps of those guys in the lab coat on the other side of the campus and saying, yeah, they've basically got it right, we can fill in and round out the story by adding a little bit more from our sources. I know there are people who argue that. E.O. Wilson certainly would like to see the consilience of science and history, basically on the grounds of science. Ian Morris has argued that history is a subset of biology, is a subset of chemistry, is a subset of physics. So basically, we have to bow to the physicist. And I see this point, but it's not what I think of as useful history. And I want to say that here, John and I, another way we agree, is that I think these disciplinary differences are important, and I think they're embedded in the genealogy of knowledge, which has brought us to where we are today. And we can rely on that to a certain extent to reformulate our questions. So I would like to take us back to what history means as a discipline. Not history as the past, but history as a particular practice or set of practices for understanding certain facets of what it means to be human and change across time. And so what I would suggest here is that history, as it developed as a discipline, didn't just say what happened in the past and what were human beings even doing in this past, but it wanted to find out about certain aspects of what it meant to be human. And I began here with Jean Bodin, a 16th century Frenchman, who wrote a beguiling book called An Easy Method for the Comprehension of History, which I recommend to you all. And he divides history. It's one of the early moments where he's dividing divine history, which he calls holy and inscrutable and riven with miracles, so you can't really know it. So there's divine history, and there's natural history, which is inevitable and predictable. And then there is human history, which is only probabilistic. It's not inevitable. We can't quite know where it's going. And that's where he's creating a space for human will, and perhaps even for human hope. And his treatise on republicanism, there were 6 volumes in this book, were carried to this country and formed the basis for the Mayflower Compact, which is the earliest, they claim, democratic governmental document written by people who were not of the aristocracy, who had had no experience, some of whom were indentured servants. And they come to this country bearing Bodin's works as an example of where history might go. So there was this hopefulness about the capacity of human beings to act at one of the inaugural moments of the discipline. And I can also go on about how this happened in Japan with Auguste Sorai, who is a 17th century Neo-Confucianist who makes a distinction between nature, Shizen, and Sakui, invention. What can human beings do? How can they operate? Not with complete free will, but what are our possibilities? What might we do? Then, of course, the discipline itself actually entered into universities in the way we know it today in the 1890s, all around the world, including Japan. And in many ways, it cemented a notion that history was about human beings. Really, in fact, only some human beings. It turns out that the human beings that have the most history live in Europe, They tend to be white, they tend to be male, you know all this. Interestingly enough, this is also true in Japan. I just did a study of Japanese universities where it turns out that there's a lot of Japanese history in Japan, as you might expect, but there's even more European history. And America, not so much. We only have less than 4% of Japanese historians who are interested in this country, which I felt sort of miffed about because, as you know, it was Matthew Perry who bludgeoned his way into Tokyo and opened up Japan in the 19th century. You'd think we'd get a little recognition for that. Evidently not. So history was a very uneven discipline from its very inception. And it forms in universities in the late 19th century to ask the question of what can human beings do? And it rejected arguments from nature. They weren't very interested in arguments from nature, and they seemed to be particularly interested in history as filled with anticipatory content. The idea that we looked at the past in order to denature the present so we could imagine different futures. This was the political function of history in the phrases of Reinhard Koselleck. This is why we bothered to do history, not just to be antiquarians, not just to tell stories, but actually to rethink possibilities. And this meant that we developed all sorts of techniques. There are certain ways in which we highlight things in what I'm calling now late Holocene history. The very end of the Holocene, we developed this discipline, which is in some ways complicit, I would argue, with the creation of the Anthropocene. It sees the future as filled with hope. The story of liberty is what the great Italian historian Benedetto Croce called history, the story of liberty. It also looks very much at agency and thought and not passivity. R.G. Collingwood, who wrote Theory of History and also a book on the concept of nature, says that historians, we don't ask how people eat or drink or sleep or make love. What we're interested in is what they think about. And unless these animal activities are incorporated into social systems, we don't really pay very much attention to them. So we think the thoughts of men after them is his very famous phrase. And so this really, the focus there is not on all human activities, but only on some human activities. It doesn't valorize the body or the physicality. And likewise, it's always very interested in production rather than reproduction. And here, of course, we're getting at the divide in the genders, but also in terms of certain kinds of labor, which were initially eliminated from the kinds of political history that had sway in the early 20th century, and were only re-injected into the historical study really in the post-war period. And one of the really important aspects of this late Holocene history was to deny natural determinism. If you declared that an argument was deterministic, off with their heads. There was a sad guy got the nickname Malaria Jones because he suggested that the Greeks, the ancient city-states collapsed because malaria came in and people got sick, and he was ridiculed and laughed out of Cambridge, basically, in the early 19th century. So denying natural determinism. So we have this discipline which is dedicated to promoting the idea that we can move through time probabilistically, that we have a certain kind of agency in relationship to what we can choose to do, and that this takes place against a backdrop that is probabilistic, a natural stage where the natural systems function probabilistically, and indeed it often assumes a kind of infinitude to natural abundance, so that political problems can be solved through growth and through redistribution, and that this is the infinite resource that we simply need to rearrange in order to create a hopeful history. So if we don't have that, if we don't have that probabilism, if we don't have this infinite natural abundance, what do we got? Well, I'm wrapping up here. I think as we move from Holocene history to Anthropocene history, we're going to have to let go of a lot of our greatest hopes. I don't think that we can any longer imagine our way towards liberty and abundance for all on the levels we once hoped to do. 80% of the world's population lives on less than $10 a day. We are already using approximately 1.5 planets worth, and our natural systems are not refurbishing what we're using any longer. So the idea that we're going to move from 7.5 billion people to over 10 billion people at the end of this century and supply them all with the lifestyles of those of us in this room, or even those people who are making the average American income of about $44,000 a year, is a pipe dream. And I think we have to be honest about that as we imagine what might be a possible future. All that said, it's not hopeless if we change our hopes. And I would say that we have to let go of that story of infinite abundance and endless liberty and wealth for all, and replace it with a kind of resilience with decency, which is more modest, I admit, but does suggest that we are not going to be in the position of waves of refugees and endless war. And when I say resilience with decency, I mean we need to begin to tell stories about systems which did not become more and more efficient and more capable of producing wealth, which after all is the story of modernity. Instead, we need to look at systems from the past which were complex enough to weather changes like the Little Ice Age, like volcanoes, like bad harvests, without erupting into war or revolution. And one of the examples of a place like this is Tokugawa, Japan, which was fairly isolated from the rest of the world and did not export its human population and did not import food, and managed to live for 250 years in peace, which, is not a bad idea. And we need to recapture that story, not as the prelude to modernity, but as a possible way of moving away from the linear narratives to trying to discuss complex, resilient systems. But this has all sorts of formal challenges. A good story has a beginning, middle, and end. We're used to narratives. This is what you tell your students to go look for. This is what grabs us. Nonlinear narratives can begin to feel a lot like chronicles, which often lose their meaning. It's just one darn thing after another. So how do we still have meaningful human histories while losing the narrative form? How do we add more actors, some of whom are non-human, to this story and still have agents that make sense to us? How do we add all that we receive? Air, water, food, our bodies, our genes, the toxins in our environment that are in our systems. How do we politicize that passivity as well as talk about the politics of the active mind? And how also do we cope with the scales of time and space that the Anthropocene presents to us, which are so extraordinary and unusual for historians to begin to try to think about? So I think we have to leave the older forms of history and begin to move towards new forms of history, both in our hopes for history and in the very formal protocols we use to represent the past. So I think there still is a role for history. It is a very important role for history, and indeed I would argue that it is even more important than the science in the end, because what is even frailer than our frail bodies on this changing planet is our ideas of justice, decency, playfulness, and beauty. So thank you very much.
Okay, John, join us. So we're open for questions, comments. The one requirement is that you wait for a microphone and you identify yourself before you ask your question. No, you don't get to ask any questions. You've talked long enough. Seriously, you want to speak?
Yeah, I want to know why the word fascism was lurking above David
yes.
Christian's head.
Sorry. You know, you made some mistakes in your PowerPoint.
I feel like can everybody hear me? I don't know whether I'm yelling or not.
This is all being taped. This is one of the reasons why they want to make sure that we
Okay.
speak in microphones, and you as well.
Okay. The reason fascism was lurking above David Christian's head is not that I am accusing David Christian of being a fascist. He is a lovely man. One of the reasons that historians got very nervous about injecting nature into history is that in the 20s, 30s, and 40s, references to nature become a major trope of fascist ideology. And I know this from the Japan perspective. There's a man named Watsuji Tetsudo who's trained by Heidegger, and he comes back to Japan and he writes a book called Fudo, which is about climate, which claims that the Japanese are different from every other culture because they've got this particular kind of climate, which of course, if you actually know something about climate and the extraordinary length of Japan from the subtropics all the way up to northern, to Hokkaido, where it's quite cold, the notion of a climate is a bit tenuous. But we see these references in fascism in Italy and also in Germany, and the notion of the nation as a natural entity and nature as being the source of political authority made a lot of people in Japan and elsewhere quite nervous about talking about nature. And indeed, the Annales School, which had worked very hard to begin to think about the Mediterranean as a kind of the longue durée there and thinking about natural forces, when Emmanuel Laurent-Ladoury had written his dissertation and suggested in that dissertation that there was a certain amount of natural determinism, and this was in 1963, his committee jumps on him and says, "You've got to take that out. You can't, I know your evidence shows," they basically say, "I know your evidence shows that deforestation caused certain things, but that's way too deterministic. We've got to put the human agent back in there." And so the move then in the 70s to start through environmental history to talk about nature was far enough removed from that earlier ideological moment, or at least that's the way I see it, so that they weren't thinking about that. But I think that's haunted some people in the mid-20th century from talking about nature. So that's why. Does that make sense?
Yes, ma'am.
I'm Linda Yar from George Washington University, and so I come at this more from the discipline of political science or international relations. So thinking about the term, the Anthropocene, as the impact of humans on a whole era, for me it's, of course, which humans. It's not all humans, and it's very, definitely a notion of power and production that's cited within a very, within Europe, North America, those sites. So how do you deal with, from the standpoint of history, what is the best way to cope with that tension?
So the point that you make is one that anthropologists and historians like to make, disaggregating the human species, and as I said in my presentation, trying to remind the geologists and stratigraphers of the utility of that, particularly when one is interested in causation, how things got to be the way that they are, which is not a preoccupation, as I said, among the stratigraphers. The one tiny emendation I would make in what you said is that at the moment, China is by far the biggest contributor of greenhouse gases and other sources of disruption. That's a recent development, only 10 or 15, only 10 years old at the most.
Yeah, I think one of the currents in this debate of the uneven contributions has to do with the word Capitalocene, which you've probably read some of. And this is a set of books now. There's several books that are arguing that the problem is capitalism. And they go back to Marx, and now Marx is the saint of eco-socialism. And I have several problems with that argument, which certainly I wouldn't say that capitalism has nothing to do with this problem. But those of us who are interested in East Asia would rather see the term developmentalism used, because there are many ways, including communist systems, which have been dire towards the environment. And the other aspect is that oftentimes these people who are arguing for the Capitalocene, including Andreas Malm and Alf Hornberg, basically blame a few Manchester industrialists for taking the steam engine and using it like a machine gun against the rest of the world. So if only we had a time machine, we could kill off 2 or 3 people in Manchester and everything would be fine. And that argument seems to me to reverse the work that's been done in terms of globalizing the productive capacities of this world, and it makes capitalism into something that's purely Western European, rather than something that also relied on colonialism and imperialism in order for it to work. And one of the great reminders of that is this recent book by Amitav Ghosh, The Great Derangement, Climate Change and the Unthinkable, who makes a very clear case that it's not simply a few people in England who were to blame and somehow, continue to be blameworthy.
I should add that Amitav Ghosh spoke in the seminar in the fall and about that book, which was terrific.
Wonderful.
Yeah. So, yes, sir.
Ken Dillon, Cientia Press. One of the curious aspects of it, and I think you referred to it in passing, about earth science and planetary science, is that they're both historical sciences. And historical in a very basic way, that what happens at any particular time, or what is happening, is based on what happened before. That there is a continuity there, and it's contingent change. And that causes problems, my understanding is, for earth scientists and planetary scientists sometimes in dealing with the other natural scientists, who might tend to look down on them a little bit as just, counting rocks or whatever, this kind of thing. And I'm wondering, what effect have you seen in dealing with the geologists or of this aspect of their science, that it is an historical science?
So I have not seen any evidence of other sciences looking down upon geologists, because theirs is a historical science. If that's happening, I'm not aware of it, and it doesn't manifest itself within the Anthropocene Working Group, perhaps only because it's overwhelmingly made up of geologists, although there is the odd soil scientist and others. But there are lots of scientific disciplines that are essentially historical. A good chunk of biology is historical. Astronomy and cosmology are historical. I would say that it's probably, and indeed, from a certain perspective, even chemistry and physics are historical because the physical properties of objects have changed since the Big Bang, although they are practiced as if they are not historical. But outside of mathematics, I'm not sure there are any scientific disciplines that cannot be understood as historical. At any rate, I haven't seen what you're alluding to, and I haven't heard the geologists voice a sense of being looked down upon by their colleagues. It may be going on, but I haven't seen it.
Yes. And then back there.
Jim Bartholomew, Emeritus from Ohio State University. In terms of the politics of the academy and dealing with the whole concept of the Anthropocene, I think it's interesting to consider the issue of how optimistic or pessimistic we should be about the human future. You have such statements from Pope Francis saying that people should be careful about reading like rabbits. He actually said that. He has some training in chemistry formally, which is something new. Then, with reference, of course, to China, President Xi Jinping has a 4-year degree in chemistry, which is absolutely new for someone of such prominence there. So then you can say, well, there are limits, which were mentioned by Julia in some length. At the same time, at the beginning of the 20th century, some very prominent people in Britain, I can't remember, was it Lord Raleigh, thought that everything that could be known about physics had already been discovered. Of course, that was totally wrong. So I'd be interested in people's perspectives on how you feel about a more optimistic projection of human success on the planet, or less of a successful future, and so on.
Well, I can't. I don't know how one would. You'd have to do a poll, but there's a lot of. It would rest on what you say is success. And there's that great book by Kurt Steger who says, you know, we may go up to temperatures as high as in the Eocene, about 16 degrees Fahrenheit hotter than today, but the human species is going to be just fine. Well, what he means by that is that a few of us will be staggering around in hot, dank swamps and still be capable of breeding. And, you know, that's certainly one definition of fine. Personally, you know, not mine, but what do we do with that? And I think that it depends on what you hope for. I mean, the kind of Larry Summers idea that there is no limit to what the planet can carry, the carrying capacity of the planet, seems to me absolutely potty. I mean, it's inaccurate. And the economists who believe in infinite substitutability, they haven't figured out how to substitute for oxygen or for water yet. And we now have 400 dead zones in the oceans. And when we say dead zones, these are no longer producing oxygen. And so the amount of oxygen is going down as the amount of carbon is going up. So it's not just that the carbon is rising, but we're actually getting less and less oxygen, which just recently they have explained is necessary for certain neural functions. And as we're breathing less and less oxygen, presumably our brain capacities will go down. And the odd thing I find as an historian is, how would we know? How would we measure, given our vast difference of capacities, what past brains look like and what present brains look like?
We'd get sleepy in the afternoons more quickly.
I'm there already.
So very quickly, I describe myself as a pessimist of the mind and optimist of the heart. I think that the two biggest parts of the grand equation are the energy system and population. And I think both of those are susceptible, within a time frame of 50 to 100 years, of radical amelioration. I think it's a better than 50% chance that we will create a global energy system in which fossil fuels play a much smaller part than the 75 to 80% role that they play now. And I'm also quite confident that the deceleration in the rate of population growth that we've witnessed since about 1972 will continue, primarily because of urbanization and formal education of females. We may be 10 billion before that is achieved, and that may be disastrous, although I do not expect that it would be. So I see it as a 50 to 100 year window in which some radical reforms of the human operation are required, but I also think that they are possible, quite possible.
The back, yes.
Yeah, hi, thank you. Tad Daly is my name. I'm with an NGO called Citizens for Global Solutions. So I'm a political hack and a policy wonk and not a professional in this field. But I want to ask about a specific moment. Professor McNeill, I know there's arguments about when the Anthropocene happened. You've chosen 1945 or 1950. I want to know why more people don't talk about the dawn of agriculture, which I think is 10 or 15,000 years ago, and it, A, completely transformed huge chunks of the land surface of the planet, B, completely transformed ecosystems in 1,000 different, millions of different places, and C, fundamentally transformed the human condition. So you're the historian, not me, but I would argue more than virtually anything else in the entire human story, that moment, that event, the invention of agriculture. So A, why don't we hear a little bit more about that as the dawn of the Anthropocene? And while I'm on the subject, why did it happen independently at virtually the same time? I mean, this is my understanding. 4 or 5 different places, China, India, Mesopotamia, Egypt, and the Americas. Agriculture is invented at roughly the same time, without, certainly in the Americas, without them getting the ideas from other humans. How and why did that happen?
Okay, those are two questions that they have some connection, but I'll take them as different questions. And the latter one first. So the various transitions to agriculture, which probably began 11,000 years ago, as far as we know, and of course new archaeological finds and new genetic material could change our understanding of this by evening, but nonetheless 11,000 years ago, and probably at least 7 independent transitions to agriculture over the next 7,000 years. And from certain perspectives, 7 in 7,000 years seems almost all at once, because prior to that, there's a 150, 200,000 year history of our species with, as far as we know, 0 transitions to agriculture. So why do we get a handful of them almost all at once, if you can accept the notion that 7,000 years is almost all at once? So as I understand it, the leading explanation for this puzzle is that 2 conditions had to be met. One of them was the great defrosting. So from 130,000 years ago until the end of the last ice age, which is a gradual process, but we can date it to maybe 23,000 to about 10,000 years ago. Until that had been achieved, aridity and cold in large parts of the world made the probability of agricultural transitions low, or lower than they would subsequently be with the great defrosting. And in the comparatively warm and lush parts of the world, there's no good reason to make any transition to agriculture. No reason, to put it this way, nobody, parenthetically I should say, nobody intended any transition to agriculture as a gradual process, entirely unwitting. But nobody had incentives to experiment in directions that would lead to domestication of plants or animals. So there is a climatic argument, the condition that had to be met. And the second argument is that this was the first time, after the end of the last ice age, when you had intelligent Homo sapiens. So the other condition that had to be met was a sufficiently good brain to undertake the experimentation with plants that led over dozens of generations to domestication. And in the other interglacials, our ancestors were too dumb to undertake those experiments or to recognize the advantage of scattering certain kinds of seeds over other kinds of seeds and doing it consistently year after year, which is how eventually you get to domestication. Now, why don't people use the advent of agriculture as the birth date for the Anthropocene? Some people do, but not many. It's more, at least within the Anthropocene working group, it's on the order of 1 or 2 people who make that case out of 37 members. I don't know what the ratio would be in the larger scientific and scholarly communities, but I don't think it would be a whole lot higher than 3-5%. Why not? First of all, within the profession of geology, there are objections to that because that's when the Holocene began, 11,700 years ago. So they already got an epoch denoted that coincides very closely to the agrarian era of human history. So why have the Anthropocene be exactly the same as the Holocene? That doesn't make a whole lot of sense from their point of view. And they'd also have to find a golden spike. Now, they've got one that's pretty good for the Holocene, but there would be that practical problem from the point of view of the profession of geology. There are other objections, too. There is, particularly from this anthropologist whom Julia mentioned, Andreas Malm in Sweden, the objection that he doesn't like the term Anthropocene because he thinks it means all of humans and it should only be industrial magnates who deserve recognition for bringing on this epoch. So from his point of view, if you adopted the dawn of agriculture, you would in effect be implicating all agrarian communities, and that is morally and politically unacceptable to him. This is, I would say, maybe 10% of the scholarly and scientific community. Well, 10% of the scholarly, 1% of the scientific community takes this view. It's morally and politically unacceptable to use that for those reasons, because it implies a certain responsibility being much more broadly shared than they would like it to be. And then lastly, from the Earth system scientists' point of view, the people who pay attention particularly to these biogeochemical cycles, you do not see, with the advent of agriculture, any significant changes to the nitrogen cycle, the water cycle, the sulfur cycle, or even the carbon cycle. It takes a long time for those things to show up. So those are some of the objections.
Yes, right here. Hold on for the microphone.
Julia, I was struck by 2 things you said. We're going to have to let go of our greatest hopes, and it's not hopeless if we change our hopes. And I tend to agree with that. I've never put it in quite such clear terms, so thank you for doing that. But by the way, I'm chair of the Sierra Club Virginia chapter, so I'm involved in trying to move our country in the direction of dealing with this. Those are not 2 phrases that would sell very well in a political campaign. And so, and John somewhat answered it by saying it could happen in 50 years, as I understood him saying that. But do either of you have any thoughts on if in fact that is what is necessary, how are we as a society going to go about, and as a planet, as a human species, going to go about making that happen a little faster rather than a little slower?
Seth, you didn't say your name.
Thought I did. Seth Heald is my name, as you know,
Yeah.
and I'm chair of the Sierra Club Virginia chapter.
You know, one of the things that I've been thinking a lot about is the sort of ethical and political moment that we inhabit. And the ways we've structured our society, and in large part history operates this way, is with a kind of prosecutorial intent, with the idea of finding a culprit and figuring out how to get them to pay restitution of some sort. And I think that this is one of the reasons why people get so angry about the concept of the Anthropocene, and why it's been difficult to move forward with people, because they see it as some people are going to be guilty and some people are going to be not guilty. And I've thought a lot about this as a sort of personal issue as well, which is how does one behave ethically oneself? And when I think about how I might live as, you know, someone who, like most people on the planet, lives off less than $10 a day, you know, I envision moving out of the apartment and not really being able to keep my job and et cetera. You know, all of a sudden I am not in a position to do anything. And so that can't be the ethical imperative of this moment, is to somehow join with the global average and try to live that way, because I'm a guilty Westerner who has produced lots more carbon than is my fair share, which I have. So rather than think about it in those kind of prosecutorial terms, is to look at, to say that we are all complicit, but we are also all victims and victimizers at the same time. And what I think was so brilliant about COP21 was that it moved away from the earlier iterations of climate conferences, where the idea was to find out who was most guilty and who had to give up the most and try to negotiate those details, and simply say, we all want to live in a livable planet. What can we each contribute? And Andrew Light at George Mason, a philosopher who was actually you may have, actually, Seth, you may know him. You should. He's wonderful. So the transformation and approach at COP21, which was to say, okay, you know, everybody step up. Let's try to have people agree that the general goal is one we all share. And rather than figure out who's the guilty party and who's the not guilty party, have everybody agree to make some sort of contribution. And of course, that was very mixed. You know, we didn't get to below 2 degrees global average temperature, let alone the 1.5 they were hoping for. And a lot of people, like my friends in South Korea, said, okay, our contribution is not to emit this much carbon, but to emit only this much carbon more. You know, so there was, you know, there was lots of waffling, but it allowed us to achieve some sort of cohesion. And I think if we can move away from the sense that we have to micromanage the guilt for this, that it might work better. At least it seemed to in Paris. I don't know whether you agree with that. Do you agree with that?
I don't know that I do or not. I might not.
You might not. That's okay. Let's keep talking.
So, if I was right a few minutes ago when I said that the big pieces of the equation are the energy system and total population, then my recommendation is to focus on the energy system for 2 reasons. First, I think it's the bigger of the 2 parts of the equation, and secondly, there's a dark history of trying to manage numbers in population, and I also think that that issue is in effect going to take care of itself because of the long-term trends that I mentioned, urbanization and more formal education for females. But pushing the energy transition would be, I think, priority number 1, 2, and 3. And there are a heap of different ways to do this. None of them are making any progress in the United States. Well, not on the national level. They are on state and local levels. But in truth, the initiative has passed from Washington to Beijing. Washington had 30 or 40 years to try to push the energy transition ahead and didn't do it. But now, if it's going to happen, it's likelier to happen as a result of Chinese initiatives than American ones.
Well, I think this is an appropriate place to sort of close this session. I want to mention that there will be no seminar on Monday for Thanksgiving week, but we will reconvene the following Monday, November 27th, where Kathleen Smith will speak about her new book, Moscow, 1956, The Silenced Spring. Please join me in thanking our speakers, Julie and John.